Hey, this is John. Welcome back to Modern Old School Developer. In this episode, we're going to work on furthering the integration between the back end and the front end. So the first thing I want to be able to do is I want to be able to select a movie from this list, pull the information about that movie from the back end, so movie data, categories, and actors, and then update these forms. So why don't we go into VS Code and open up our back end. We're going to need a new endpoint. We need to be able to get a specific movie. So let's make a new endpoint, app.get, and we have a few options. We could add a query parameter to our movies, or we could simply tack the ID onto the end, which is what I'm going to do. So I'll do movies/ID. We're going to put that inside curly braces. That's how we're going to associate our function parameter with our route. And then we need to do a response model, and rather than being a list of schema's movie files, it's going to be a schema's movie because it's just, one movie. So we will say get movie, and it's going to be ID, which is an integer type, and we need a database again, so session depends get database. Then we're going to get the movie. So movie should be crud.getMovie, and we'll pass it the database and the ID. And if movie is none, we'll do something. Otherwise, we'll return the movie. So we'll work on that in just a minute. Let's open up our CRUD file and actually work on that getMovie function. All right, get all actors, get all movies. Let's do one that is just get movie. So it's going to be very similar to this. So we'll just copy that down here. And it's going to be get movie. And we need the database and an ID, which is an integer. And we're going to return a models movie. Okay, so this would return all the movies. We do not want that. We want to be able to get a specific movie. So how can we use this identifier to get the movie we actually want? So we can take out the all, the order by, and both joins because we're only getting one movie. What we need in there is a filter. So we'll do .filter, and we're going to say models.movie.id equals the ID. And even though we're only getting one thing in here, this filter could return more than one movie. It won't because we're going on a primary key, but you can see where some filters might return more than one thing. So it will return a list anyway. So we need to say we want the first result, which is going to be the only result for this. So this is going to return either a movie or it's going to return none if there is no first response. So if we have a bad ID, we won't get the movie. So let's go back over here, and that should work now. Let's go ahead and fix this movie none thing. We're going to do this very similar to how we did the duplicate categories and whatnot. So let's go ahead and say we will raise an exception, and we will do this, but it's not going to be a 409 conflict. It's going to be an HTTP 404 not found. And we're going to say movie with ID does not exist. So that will be our message. And we need to also add that to our responses. So let's go ahead and copy that. And if we get this, we'll do that. And our responses is going to be a 404. And the description will be invalid ID. Okay, there we go. That should be able to get us an ID. Let's go test out our endpoint real quick. If I go into the docs, you will see we now have, there it is, get movie, here it is. All right, so if we get movie, we get one by the ID. Let's try it out. We'll get it with ID 1. Hey, there we go. ID 1 is avatar. What if I get ID 50? 404 not found. Movie ID 50 does not exist. So there we go. Now we will get the right things and we will handle the errors if we have them. Okay, so that handles our endpoint. Let's go back to 1 and see what we actually get. So you can see we've got a file name and a name. Actors, categories, serial, all these other things are null or empty, which makes sense because we haven't actually done any editing or anything to update this in the database. All we did was import it and set the name to be whatever the file name was without the extension. All right, so now that we can do that, we should be able to set the fields that are over here. There won't be any change visibly right now, but after we do that, we will make a way to update some fields and see how that works. So let's open our movie list component, because what we want to do is we want to handle the onChange event. And right now, I believe it is being handled by Formic, but we need to do something in addition to what Formic is doing. So let's see if we can make that happen. I believe Formic is already handling the onChange event, so I'm not sure this will work, but let's try it out. I'm going to say onChange equals a function. It's going to get an event, and we're going to do a couple things. I want to console log the event, and I also want to console log formic.values movie ID. So I want to see what it does there. So if I hit save on there, what does it do over here? Okay, and you can see that I can't change it anymore, and that's because we are not doing things the Formic way. So what we need to do is formic.handleChange, and we need to supply the event first. So if we do that, I believe it should work. There we go. So we are changing it, and we have the new value. So we can still let Formic manage this for us and do something else in addition, which is what we want to do. So what we're going to do is actually we're going to make our own handler for this. So all I want to do is run a function after this. So we'll say this is the onSelectMovie handler, and we're just going to run that. So all we need to do now is actually define that function. So let's define it up here. Const onSelectMovie equals an async function. It does not need any parameters because we already have the Formic values. Actually, we don't. Well, yeah, we do have Formic in here. We could use that, or we could pass the value. I guess it'd be easier to do that. So let's say formic.values.movieID, and we will take the ID, which is a number, not an int in JavaScript. All right, so this, the type undefined. Okay, so we need to know if we have a movie ID. We won't necessarily have this. If we do have this, we need it to be a number, but that still won't work if it's undefined, which it won't be, but it doesn't have any way to know that it won't be undefined at this point. We could do this, I think. Yeah, because once Formic has handled this change, the value, I think, will definitely be there. So why don't we just test that by doing a console log of ID. So if we go up here and clear this out, 2, 1, 23, 2, 4. So yeah. Okay, so yeah, it's definitely working. It's not going to be null there or undefined at that point. It's definitely going to have a value because we ran the Formic handler first. So now that we have that, we need to be able to get the movie and then update the values that are going on. So let's start off by getting the information from the backend. So let's do const response equals await fetch. It's going to be a get request. we need to supply a URL. This is going to be process.env react app backend, and it's going to be movies, and it's going to be with that identifier. All right, so that should get us our response. And then I want to do const data equals await response.json if the response is okay. Because it might not be. I mean, it will be because we're going to get values in here, but let's just handle it anyway. So if our response is okay, let's do a console.log of the data. And let's see what we get from that. I'll clear that out. And there we go. We're getting all of our data there. So we've got actors, categories, file names, yada, yada. All right. So we can now fetch information from the database. How are we going to update those things? All right, so let's go ahead and use the formic object to set the field values that we need. So why don't we do formic.set field value. And we need the field, which is a string, and the value. So the field in this case is going to be, what did I call that? Go over to movie data real quick. What did we call the name? It is movie name. Let's set that. So we'll set movie name to be data dot. It doesn't know what's being returned, so we should do something about that. Should be dot name. So let's do that. So let's see if that works, and then we can make more of the fields happen. So there we go. You can see we are changing based on the name. That's the one thing we actually have in the database to try out. So that's the one thing we actually change. Yeah, so the rest of the fields, you know, it's harder to see because they're all blank right now anyway. But at least we have this. So why don't we skip the rest of the fields just for a minute, and we'll come back to those. But let's make something that can update this section here, the movie data. That way we'll be able to see more fields in here, and there won't be, null values. All right, so back in our main page, we have our form submit handler. So this has all of the values, but we're just logging to the screen right now. But why don't we do something to actually update information? So what do we have over there? We've got the name, the studio, the series, and the series number. So let's see if we can make an endpoint that will update those four things. So let's go back into our backend. And here we're going to make another endpoint for movies. We've got our get and our post. We need a put to be able to update a movie. So let's see about making one of those. So it's going to be app.put. Our endpoint is going to be movies, and we want to update a specific movie ID again. So we need to do that. And then we're going to do a response model, and that is going to be the new movie. So it'll be just returning the movie that it updates. Update movie data. All right, we need an ID, which is an int, and we need db, which is a session, equals depends get database. All right, there we go. So the first thing we need to do is actually get the movie based on that ID. So let's start by doing that, and we can just do crud.getMovie ID. If movie is none, we'll fix that in a minute. But let's assume that it's not going to be null, or it's not going to be none, and let's actually make some changes. So we also need some movie data. We need an actual body for our request. So let's go define a schema for that. So what we're going to have in a All right, so down here under JSON schemas, we're going to make a new class. This is going to be a movie update schema. So we'll put it down here, class movie update schema, and we'll derive it from base model. it's going to have a few properties. It's going to have a name, which is a string. It's going to have a series ID, which is an int. It's going to have a series number, which is an int. And it's going to have a studio ID, which is also an int. So those are the 4 properties on that page. So if we get something that looks like this, we will have a proper movie update schema. So let's go back to main.py, and we're going to have a movie update schema. So our data is going to be movie update schema. Doesn't seem right at all, does it? There we go. Let's fix that. Okay, there we go. We've got our stuff there. All right, so now we need to actually do something with the movie. And what we're going to do is we're going to say update this movie. So actually, we're not even going to worry about getting the movie. We're just going to say update the movie. So we will say CRUD update movie. We'll give it the ID and the data schema and the database itself. And we will hope that works, and if it doesn't, we will handle that later. So we need to make this update movie function in the CRUD module. So let's go back over into this. Define update movie. We have a database, which is a session, an ID, which is an integer, and a data, which is a schemas.movie update schema. And it returns models.movie. All right, so we'll start off by doing the same thing we're going to do in the last thing, which was movie equals get movie, database and integer, and the identifier. If movie is none, return none. So we won't make any changes if we don't actually have that movie. All right, first things first, let's ignore this update if there aren't any actual updates. So let's say if the data.name is the same as the movie name, and data.studioID equals movie studio ID, and data.series ID equals movie series ID, and data.series number equals movie.series number. If all of these things are true, then this is the exact same thing. We're not going to change anything at all. So we will simply return the movie at this point unchanged. Otherwise, all we have to do is set the properties and commit that to the database. So whenever you change a model you get from the database, it's making things in the background for when you commit. It's making a database record. So let's go with movie.name equals data.name. There we go. We have all of those things. And we're going to say if the movie is not processed. Well, once you update it, that is what we're going to call being processed. So we will say movie.processed equals true. Finally, we will commit this, and we will refresh this with our new movie, and we'll return our movie. So there we go. We can now update a movie in the database. There are a couple things I think we need to fix. On the schemas, I said these things would be strings, integers, but they might be none. They might be null values. So we actually need to make them be optional. So it should be optional string, because we could be erasing everything about this movie, and that would be just fine. Okay, so what else would we need to do for this? I think this actually should work okay. Yeah, this should be okay. So now that we have that all set up, let's handle this case, a movie being none. And we're going to do it very similar to how we did the last thing. We're just going to raise that same exception. We're going to raise the 404 not found exception. So there we go. We'll do that. And we will keep this responses model over here. And there we go. You can't update a clip, doesn't exist. All right, so that should be good for the back end. So now we need to be able to call that from the front end and actually do something with it. So let's go back over to the front end. So when we submit one of these, what's going to happen? Right now, all we do is log the values, but that's not what we want to do. So we actually are only interested in certain values from the form. In other words, those 4 fields. So we need to make an object that is our payload. So let's say const body equals an object, and we're going to have a name property, and we are going to say values.movieName. If you exist, it's going to be a string here. So I want to say that the length, what was that? Length is greater than 0. If our string is not the empty string, then we're going to use values.movieName. Otherwise, we're going to say null. If you delete movie name, don't put it in as the empty string, put it in as a null value. Okay, so we also have the series ID, value.movieSeriesID. And again, I only want that if it exists. So if it is empty, we do not want that. And remember, this is also a string property, or it might be undefined. So if we have not that, VS Code, so if the length is greater than 0, we will cast this to an integer. So we want values.movieSeriesID, which, yeah, we didn't put the check on this quite right. However, it won't be undefined here. So I'm just going to say it will exist. Otherwise, we're going to give this the null value. It's not happy with that check. Okay, let's make this a little bit easier. So the series ID, it can be a string or it can be undefined. This can only be a string. Yeah, okay, so yeah, this could have been undefined, which this one can only be a string, right, because that's a select box. All right, so I think we need to change that. We did make none values in there, and they are the empty string. So let's go fix our type definitions real quick. Let's go back into our form types. And we said that this movie series ID could be a string or it might be undefined. I'm going to say that is no longer true. Same thing for the studio ID and same thing for the series number. These things are all going to be nulls. So now that's not going to work on main page because we've got them being undefined, but actually I want them to be just the empty string. And that should be okay because we set those values of none to be the empty string. So that should be all right. All right, so let's go back over here. So now this is not going to be undefined. It can no longer be undefined. All right, so yeah, there we go. So we also need series number, which is going to be value movie series number dot y, VS Code y. If it's greater than 0, we will cast that to an int movie series number. Otherwise, it will be null. And finally, the studio ID is going to be values movie studio ID dot length greater than 0, and we'll say values dot movie studio ID or no. Okay, there we go. That looks good to me. All right, so now we have the object body for our payload. So what do we need to do after that? Let's work on making the form submission. So we're going to say const response equals await fetch, and our URL is process.env.react.app backend. And then we're going to be posting this or putting this to the movies endpoint. And we need the identifier. So we need something else in here. We need the movie ID. That is a form value that could be undefined. So let's start off by saying if values.movieID, we're going to wrap this whole thing in an if condition. So now we are guaranteed to have a movie ID, and we will put in values.movieID. Open our object. Our method in this case is going to be put, and our headers, we need to make the content type header be application JSON. And that is all for the headers. The body is going to be JSON stringify our body object. And I think that is all we need. So, yeah, there we go. So we now have that. And we will say const data equals await response.json. And so the other thing we need to look at right here is if our response was okay. So if response.okay, I'm not actually sure what we're going to do with bad responses right now. So I'm going to ignore them for the moment. There we go. Let's just see if it works. So when I hit submit, we'll be calling the submit handler. We'll be putting to the endpoint, and it should update. So something seems wrong. Oops, hang on. My Python backend died because it auto-imported from the wrong place for schemas. So, okay, should be okay now. If I hit refresh, all right. Oh my, it's not working still. What have I done now? All right, hang on. Let's check one more thing. All right, it seems I was wrong about the ID fetching from the movie list. We do get a number most of the time, but it's always behind one, so we haven't updated our value yet. So let's go see about fixing that. All right, I think this is not going to work because we're not going to have the new value of movie ID right after we handle the change. That won't happen until the next re-render, I think. So what I think we need to do is get rid of this entirely, leave the onChange handler as it is, and let's try doing this in useEffect. So let's do another useEffect handler. And in this case, we're going to have the arrow function, and we're going to depend on the value of formic values movie ID. So when this changes, then we'll run our function. So we've got our function. Let's just copy this. And over here, we're going to do this. And we're not going to get the ID. And we're not going to do this. And we're going to say if formic.values.movieID then we're going to get the const ID equals formic values movie ID. All right, let's see if that works better. So let's go back over here and we'll hit restart. Avatar, Batman Begin, Beauty and the Beast. Yeah, okay, I think that is working. And we're updating this component okay. So let's change the name avatar to avatar. I hit update. Hey, it's still avatar. If I set, let's see, Black Panther, that is Disney, and let's say Black Panther. Yeah, I'm not changing any other values. We have to go fix that real quick. But I do believe it did actually work. So if we go, what movie is Dark Knight? I have no idea. So I can't change that. But the handler does work now, so that's at least better. So, all right, so there's the other way to handle that. So what I need to do is set more of the field values. So we should be able to do something like that. There are a few quirks we'll have to handle for when fields are null, but I guess we'll come back and handle more of that in the next episode because we're running a little late on this one. Okay, hope that you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and come back and see us next time, where we will do more things kind of like this. It's kind of what we do here. See you next time.